Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today. We're so glad and so honored to be able to welcome the largest panel I've ever had in my Friday forum. And I'm not going to talk much because I want you to hear from all these wonderful people and colleagues. And as you're coming in, I want them to hear from you as well. So please put in the chat. This is what I always do in my Friday forums. By the way, my name is Cyndy McDonald, and I am the host for this Friday Forum show. I started these when COVID started as just a way for us to connect and figure out what we were making of all the chaos. And now, over 2 years later, because of your demand and interest, I've been able to continue these Friday Forums. So please put in the chat your name and where you're from so that my guests and my participants can see all the places you're from. I'd also love to know, how many times did you take the SAT or the ACT? And I think a lot of the answers are going to show us which generation you're in. I know I took it once, and that's the only time I took it. And I did not do very well on the SAT or ACT. No preparation, no nothing. That was not a thing when I was in school. So you can see we've got all these wonderful people from all over the world. Today, we're welcoming Lauren Sefton from Rhodes College, Christine Bowman from Southwestern, Cathy Finks from the College of Wooster, and Marano from Colleges That Change Lives. She's the new executive director. And Stephen Antonoff, who needs no introduction. You guys all know him, and he is joining us as well. And this whole team will be presenting at IECA and also at HECA. So if you're attending any of those conferences, please be sure and check out the session, come up and tell everybody hello. I will not be in Philadelphia, but I will be in Denver for sure. I also want to introduce Liane Crane. She is going to keep us all straight. She'll be monitoring chat and the questions. So thank you, Liane, for doing that. And we're glad to have Sarah here too, and she's going to be a participant. So look at all these different opportunities. And this season, as we're finishing up with our students and our seniors, we're all thinking about, well, what's next? What should we be telling our students? How are we going to guide them? What is that going to look like? And that's why we're pleased to have this session today on test optional, providing college perspectives and counselor perspectives. So let's go ahead. I'm going to share the PowerPoint and let's go ahead and get started, because I know that the time is going to go by really, really fast. All right, let's see if we can do this. And everybody let me know when you can see it. So hopefully these are showing up and everybody is seeing them. Okay, all right. So we're ready to talk about this test optional. I'm so honored, as I mentioned, to have this wonderful panel here. And I'm going to turn it over, if my PowerPoint will work. So we're going to let everybody introduce themselves a little bit. And we're going to start with Christine.
Good afternoon, or happy Friday, I should say. I'm Christine Bowman. I serve as the Dean of Admission at Southwestern University in Georgetown, Texas. And like many of you, I took the SAT once, I took the ACT once. I think I bought a big book, but to say that I quote unquote prepped is probably loosely defined. And I'm excited to share and collaborate with you today.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cathy Finks, Executive Director at the College of Wooster in Wooster, Ohio. And I am just happy that it is the second Friday past May 1. I took the SAT once, actually, and the ACT twice.
Hi, everybody. I'm Anne Marano, the relatively new, untenured, still within the first year, Executive Director of the Colleges That Change Lives. So happy to be here with Cyndy and the team. It's quite an assembly of fantastic professionals and world changers. As a first generation college bound student and college graduate, I was encouraged to take the SAT multiple times. So I didn't really know what I was doing, honestly, no prep. And I took it 4 times. And it was with pencil and paper.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lauren Sefton, Senior Associate Director of Admission at Rhodes College. And I took the SAT once, did some specific math prep on one type of math question, and then took it a second time. And that was it. Over and done. Thanks for joining us today.
Let's go on to Steve.
All right. I think that I recall taking the SAT and ACT once, although back then I believe we were using the abacus as the way to study for the math section. I've been an independent consultant for about 40 years and happy to be here. All right, we're going to move ahead. I've been on a lot of panels and few have spent as much time preparing as this group. So be prepared for some really good content. And let me briefly talk about the agenda. We're going to define test optional. We're going to then go into why the decision is made on the part of colleges to go test optional, the impact of test optional on retention, and you're going to see some really good research that has been done. We're going to talk about how do we read students without scores and what that all looks like internally. When should a student submit? The future of test optional, and then toward the end, we're going to talk about a student-centered college search. And I'm going to turn it over to Lauren to begin.
Thanks, Steve. This may feel a little elementary given our audience and the expertise in the virtual Zoom room, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page about what we're talking about here. Test optional versus test free, or what people used to call test blind, but I think we're moving in language towards test free instead to be more inclusive. So test optional, the applicant gets to decide whether or not they submit SAT or ACT scores for consideration. And it could be in the admission process, could also be in the scholarship review process. We are not talking about things like AP tests and additional tests in this program, Cambridge or IB or ACE diplomas. We're talking about SAT and ACT test optional, which, by the way, the very first college to go test optional, does anyone know it in the chat? Throw it in there. See if there's a lucky prize out there. All right, we're slow on the typing. It's actually Bowden was the very first college to go test optional in 1969. And so there's that. There we go. We got some good guesses in the chat. I love it. Excellent. The other option is test blind or test free. And that means regardless of whether or not a student submits their test scores, and see if we want to go back to the other, there we go, perfect. Regardless of whether a student submits their test scores, the college is not going to consider them at all. So it doesn't matter if you send or you don't send, the college is not looking at them. Think of it as one big black hole or blank space when it comes to testing. And at least as of March, when I checked the FairTest website, there were 83 colleges who are completely score free, SAT, ACT score free. And again, we used to use the language test blind. And then right now, I think there's a movement to move towards test free to be more inclusive in our language. So with that, we'll do a quick overview of what the three of the colleges that are on this panel have decided to do. We Rhodes went test optional because of COVID, like everybody else in the country, almost everybody else in the country did. And the faculty approved it as a 3-year pilot program. So we are entering our 3rd year of being test optional, SAT and ACT test optional, and we are putting it forth in front of the faculty to decide what we will be doing forevermore. So there are certainly some mixed opinions, and we're still in the process of doing some data research, but we're currently going into our 3rd year of test optional. And I'll pass on to Cathy.
Yeah, at the College of Worcester, we did a lot of research to figure out what would it mean for us to be a test optional school, because it isn't just looking at the values of the students coming in, but it does affect all 4 years. And some of the data points that we had and historic information that we use for predictability, it affects testing into certain classes. And so for us, it was a big decision. We actually were a little behind, I think, the CTCL larger collective pool in 2019 and had not gone test optional yet. We made the decision in the winter of 2020, right before everything blew up, that we were going test or optional. We were ready to make a big push and a big splash, and then the pandemic hit and everyone went. So we've been test optional since 2020. We are not moving backwards. We are continuing on that path. And then we are test free for merit scholarships. Christine, you're on mute.
Thank you. At Southwestern, we made the decision to go test optional prior to the pandemic, much like Wooster. And it was a decision that paralleled our overall philosophy, in which I would have described Southwestern as test neutral. Our data showed that depending on a student's rank or GPA, they were most successful regardless of what the test score was. It was when we got deeper into classes that sometimes the test became more predictable. So it's been a lovely opportunity to kind of continue to put that into play. I think the other thing that a lot of institutions are having to grapple with is how does test optional impact the building of their funnels and communication with students along the way as well? As you all probably know, we choose to acquire names in a variety of different ways, and some of that comes from testing. And with that pool shrinking immensely, it has required institutions to rethink, how do we connect with students in the beginning? How do we educate them from all points beyond? But that can be really transformational for some institutions that depend heavily on testing to build their pool. So I think you can see each of us came at it sometimes in a different fashion, sometimes with different perspectives, but we're all sitting at that same spot right now where test optional is the route we've gone. And if you want to go, great. And with the faculty perspective, I think that it's important to realize, and you may know this, but often it's not just the fact that admission offices can easily make a decision. Testing has often played a role deeper into the enrollment process, whether that comes with placement, whether that comes with the idea of successfully guiding into certain courses. And so while it may seem common sense just to do it, as Nike would say, and just wipe out testing, it's not as easy for admission offices along the way. At certain institutions, that decision doesn't live with the admission or the enrollment office. It may be a partnership with faculty. And I know for our students for our faculty, they were a little discombobulated when the idea of testing was diminished, because they did look at that as a measure for placement into certain elements. And I know in preparation for this, Lauren had shared that it is not a total admission decision at Rhodes, that it does have a faculty component as well. And so as you're hearing of institutions that sometimes do or don't make the decision, and you question why that might be the case, recognize it may not always be the opinion of the admission staff, but it may be a broader institutional philosophy from which those decisions are made. Next, please.
Yeah, and so, Christine, that's a great point. At Worcester, we also had to get faculty approval to go test optional. So even though we're in the enrollment house, and that's our job, that's what we do 24/7, we had to educate the entire faculty on what we were seeing. You know, as a college, you have your mission goals of trying to be inclusive and building a class. And so you have the knowledge of having worked with students, and you have the predictability of from what you've seen as a reader. but we didn't always have the data to say, okay, here's what it is. And so at Wooster, being a very good small research liberal arts school, we did research. And so we actually had a team of 3 of what we call AMRE students, so our combined mathematical approach students, and 1 faculty, and they took it upon themselves to do a summer research project. And so I could do a whole presentation on what the data showed, but I'm just going to share 2 data points. But I will say that what they looked at was 3 main factors. So 1, did the ACT or SAT predict first-year GPAs, which, if you know anything about first-year GPAs, they are the biggest overall predictor of retention and then graduation. 2, did it look at, how did it predict retention? And 3, moving into then graduation, was it a predictor for graduation rates? And so what we found, and again, like I said, I'll try and get through this real quick, but what we found for first year GPAs is that it did help predict. It wasn't a huge, it wasn't like a must-have predictor, but it did increase that predictability. And so it was something that we could point to that said, yeah, it does still have some relevance when we're looking at how to go about capturing that student and make sure that they're also, retaining through that first year. If you go to the next slide, when we looked at, does it pull all the way through? Can you predict it all the way to graduation? And what we found here was that no, it doesn't really help predict. And if you see these years, 2014 and 15, and you're like, well, those are from really long ago. We had to use data from 2014 and 15 to be able to look at retention, right? So these are the students that in essence graduated in 2018 and 2019. So it was a mixed bag. I will also layer in that then what they did is they looked at a whole other data points of predictability, right? So they looked to see if a student used our resource center, if they went to the learning center, if they went to the career center, if they worked with a peer mentor, if they had some kind of learning difference, could they use those as weights to help either counter this notion of not needing test scores or needing test scores? And so without going into all of that, what I will say is that it was inconclusive, right? So it did have some relevance to help us better predict those students that we were already a little perhaps nervous about because of lower test scores, not necessarily the higher test scores, but it didn't have enough overall predictability that it led us to the decision that it outweighed what we felt were inaccuracies of the testing process in general, or the inequity of the testing. And so we could say to the faculty, here's what we wanted to do. We had then data to go through to help us predict. So that's, in a nutshell, kind of what Wooster had looked at. I think it mirrors some of the other larger tests that are out there, but each school is different, and each school has to look at their own data to see how it can be used. So that's what we did to look to see whether we should go test score optional. And now Christine's going to talk about Southwestern. Once they did, what kind of data were they seeing?
Thanks, Cathy. There we go. So I have presented, because we went pre-pandemic, we were able to capture some information based on 2 different classes. On the left-hand side of the screen is our first test optional class, and that was the group that entered in fall 20. As you can see, it's a smaller population, only 49 students. But what was interesting to me is the first box in the demographic. About 20% of our students went test optional. That were first generation, 18% that were first generation chose not to. A large portion of Anglo students chose to go test optional, but also you see our Hispanic students have been a large choice on the test optional side. Southwestern has about 25 to 28% of its incoming first year class identified as Latinx. And so this is not totally a surprise for us that that population would be larger. And then underneath each of those 2 demographic classes, you'll see the retention. And you can see the difference between those that submitted the scores and those that went test optional. In that first year, from the fall of 20 to the spring of 21, you see that the retention was right on par, even for that small population between the fall and the spring. You see between the spring and the following fall that we actually, the students that went test optional retained stronger in that particular class. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see our fall of 21 test optional pool. And that was kind of at the beginning of the pandemic, or the height of the pandemic, as we're starting to see students not have access to tests. And you'll see that some of the numbers were parallel from one year to the next. You'll see that the difference in retention in that particular class was different. I do see a question that asks whether AN is American Native and AS would be considered Asian. Thank you for throwing that question out. That's just the breakdown from our data specialists. But you'll see that overall, in the second year with that larger pool, we did see a little bit of change between the test optional retention and the non-test optional retention. And so we'll continue to monitor this. Does 2 classes of data historically significant make? Is this something that we become more concerned about? I think either way, we're continuing to see strong success with those students, although not as high as the students that submitted scores. But I also don't think it has raised a concern with us. I also feel, at least in the state of Texas, I know many of you were putting items into the chat about statewide philosophies. We don't have a statewide philosophies. Our publics were asking for it until the pandemic hit. At the moment, they're not going back, but there were very few that were in the early phases of test optional. So for a lot of our students, if they were applying public into 1 or 2 privates, they took tests anyway. I don't think in Texas, the whole test optional movement has really enveloped the state as a whole. And my guess is others on the panel may feel the same as well. Next slide. Lauren?
Great. Sorry, I thought you were going to continue with that. My fault.
Right.
So what does reading without test scores look like? I feel like there's been some comments in the chat about where schools are leaning in. I know, Pamela, you mentioned leaning into higher rigor and trying to suss all of this out. I don't know how many of you saw that Tina Fey movie. We actually did a whole office outing to the movie theater to go and enjoy that super accurate example of college admission process. But anyway, Rhodes, so when we made the decision to switch to test optional, that also gave us the fantastic opportunity to completely revamp the way we scaffolded our reading process, which was really exciting. We also had 4 new admission counselors in our office, so that gave us some good opportunity to do that as well. For years now, for several years, Rhodes has been selectively test blind, and I will say test blind because at the time we still required an SAT or ACT, but we were test blind at a benchmark level. So if a student had a 27 or higher on the ACT or a 1300 or higher on the SAT, the admission readers would not see the specific test score. We would see that they reached that benchmark, but we wouldn't know if they had a 1300 or a 1550. And frankly, it didn't matter to us because we had also done a lot of research about the role of test scores. And we found that once you reach that level in our applicant pool, it frankly didn't matter if you went any further. That gave us enough guarantee. As much as test scores were predicting first year GPA, that was the benchmark that we needed to see it at. So we decided as an office in our test optional world that we would first read files, all files, regardless of whether a student was submitting test scores or not. Every single application would be read completely without test scores. So if I'm taking that look at your student's file for the first time, I have no idea if they've submitted test scores, and if they have, I have no idea what they are. And then in these, and we do partner reading. So that's 2 people looking at the file at the same time. No idea about test scores at all. And if we saw them in the application, you literally skimmed right over them. And I can promise you that sounds kind of, like a fantasy land, but we really did. We got out of practice of factoring in test scores at all and didn't pay any attention to it. Then the file moves on to the second reader, and the second reader would see if a student had chosen to submit test scores. And if they had, again, we were still test blind at that benchmark level. So all we would see is that we knew they submitted test scores and they were at that benchmark. or we knew they had submitted test scores, and if they were below, we would see the actual score, or we would know that they chose not to submit test scores as well. So we continued that benchmark level process for students who chose to submit test scores. But I'm going to sound like a broken record with my fellow panelists, but students were not at any disadvantage if they chose not to submit test scores for admission purposes or at Rhodes for merit scholarship purposes either.
Yeah, I can go next. I'll just quickly say that we sound very similar to what Lauren did. So we also read with partners. When we went test score optional, the readers could see those test scores if they were in the file. So could the final readers. But if they weren't in the file, they weren't at any disadvantage. I mentioned at the top that we also went test free for merit scholarship. So how our rubric works is that when we're reading, we're also reading for admissibility. At the same time, we're reading for merit scholarship levels. And we went and completely took out any tests, whether the student submitted or not, didn't matter, into our merit scholarships. We thought that was the most equitable across the division. Now, what I will say, and this goes back to that whole dilemma, sometimes if you're not in the higher, on the college side, you're like, well, why wouldn't you just go test optional? Just do it. Well, we have all this data that helps us build a class, and we had to rebuild the rubrics. I actually built it. When you rebuild the rubrics, you don't have a direct match to historical data points, right? And so you're a little bit moving into uncharted territories. And so luckily we have something called the early aid estimator. We are able to do a little bit of a test in the summer, which is where we have mini applications where students can submit before they submit a full application. And then they can get back some financial data so they can look and see what their merit scholarships might be, or their financial aid, or both. And in that summer process, I was able to see that actually it wasn't beneficial for the students. I wasn't allowing students to have enough advantage to build up in the merit pool, if you will. And so I did some tweaking. And so that's one of the reasons why you see some schools hesitating a little bit to go test optional.
And at Southwestern, we wanted to empower the student with choice. We created internally a model that for the student that probably had that 1,500 that they could choose to submit, or the student could choose not to submit. They make that selection at the time of application. We have linked our frequently asked questions in regard to our test optional policy to the application so that in theory, they could read and make sure they were making their best decision. Our staff has also been empowered to talk to them about kind of where it falls in our middle 50% and help students understand when it might be advantageous and when it might not be. For some students, it was really interesting as we've gone on this journey. They're embarrassed about their 1330 when other students are thrilled with their 1,000. And I think that context is an important thing to remember, not only for the student themselves and their backgrounds, but for the state that they come from, their educational institutions that they work through. So we wanted students to be able to have some choice. And within that, we chose to create two very different scholarship models, one that allowed testing to be considered, and one that when a student didn't submit scores, did not penalize them, but also re-emphasize the academics in a higher way, because that is what our data has traditionally shown, is that academics drives the train for success and retention. And a year later, or 2 years later, I think we're going to continue to do some evaluation. The one other element that Southwestern implemented was, instead of a writing sample to complement it, we asked students to have a 30-minute conversational interview with us. As the number of test score students has exploded, that has become a very taxing element in our reading system, but it has also allowed us to make connections in ways that we would have never had the opportunity. And we show that the yield of students that we've done test score optional interviews with versus those we have not has had a significant impact on our recruitment success. So I think as we all go through this journey, we're using different tools to determine what is most successful in our systems, how best do we support students in the journey, and what do we do to shape and round out our classes in a most successful way. And it sounds like each of us has done slightly different things to hopefully help the students on this choice and this process. Next slide.
All right, so we are talking about whether students ought to test or not. And the interesting thing about this entire conversation is that it is in the context of college admission, which for many students and many families is already stressful. When it was first announced that colleges would go test optional, and I'm not talking about as far back as Bowdoin, but mainly the University of California, I think many of us as counselors felt that this would reduce the stress level. In other words, on the chart that you see, or on the gauge that you see, that it would move the pointer from high stress to a lower stress. I don't think that has been proven to be true. And as counselors, really, we're dealing with families that are making three decisions in regard to testing. The first decision is whether to prep or not to prep. And that is a decision in and of itself. And I know with many of my 9th graders and 10th graders, this is a major question. Should they start preparing? And again, there's so many ways to look at this. But the first question is whether to prep or not. The second question is whether to test or not, and that's a separate question. And the third is whether to submit scores or not. So as counselors, we are working within a stressful environment within which we are trying our best to help students make those choices. And I totally believe my colleagues on this panel who say that a non-submission would not be looked at negatively. But I can tell you that there are many families and many students that don't believe colleges, that believe that really deep down they want to test. So that's something that we have to deal with. I can say with reasonable assurance that any sort of formula that any of us as counselors use is probably flawed. In other words, I hear people talking about, you should definitely send your scores if you're in this range, and you should, maybe in this range, you shouldn't send the scores. I think that those kinds of formulas are not very accurate and not particularly good advice. Yes, it's true that if scores are very high or very low, there may not be a much choice. But for 80–90% of the students that we see, they're not either extremely high or extremely low. So one of the things that we have to think about is, as this slide demonstrates, that it depends on whether they should submit or not. Which college, which test optional college is being considered needs to be considered. Also, we need to be looking at what the student is going to major in. There may be differences in terms of English major as compared to an engineering major. First generation expectations of college test score meanings also vary, and I may have a very different piece of advice for a first generation student in terms of submission than I would a student from a more established college going family. The breakdown of the scores, a 1100 is not always just an 1100. You can have equal scores. You can have one score that is considerably higher than another. I think we also have to look at scores within the context of a high school. So if someone's score is considerably higher than the average at a particular high school, that may also be a clue to us about whether or not we ought to suggest that the student prepare. These decisions are difficult. They need to be made with care and really looking at not only the information that we have about the college and about their admissions process, but what we know about the student and what we know about the student's priorities and the stress that test prep may cause that student, for example, is something that we ought to consider. Lots of these factors, hopefully we can talk about in the discussion. I'd like to go to the next slide and just mention that our go-to source, which is still the best source of information about policies on colleges, is FairTest. They have been proponents of test optional for decades. They provide a good listing of schools, and I have found in recent months that they are really keeping up with the changes, and it's not easy. We all know that within the last few weeks, the University of Tennessee system has decided to require test scores. MIT is requiring them. So this is a changing playing field. In conclusion, let me just say that sitting down with our students, looking at the policy of an individual college and looking at the qualities of the student and the family in front of us is the best way for us to make that piece of advice about whether testing ought to be pursued.
Thanks so much, Steve, for that. And I would like to piggyback on that and say the chat has been robust and fabulous, and you all are throwing into that conversation things that we've been tugging at as like tug of war in our conversations as we've been preparing to spend some time with you this afternoon. And so I just want to underscore how important it is, again, that Steve said, to look at the student that's in front of us. And I came to this position after just about 30 years on the secondary side and had the privilege of working with thousands of mostly first generation students from historically excluded backgrounds or limited income backgrounds. And the conversation can change when you're working with that population, sometimes around test prep and how prepared or not they feel for the exam and whether or not that exam will add or detract from their application, from their overall profile. And in a very colleges that change lives sort of way, what it does is force us or strengthen us in our conversations around there are other parts of the application, and there are other parts, other things about that student that they will present in that application that can be highlighted. And sometimes a student who doesn't have access to a lot of co-curricular programs or opportunities to let their own talents shine may be better served by taking an exam if they've had a history of being a good test taker, whatever a good test taker is. Again, that's an individual decision, because that will bring something to the application because they're lacking in that other area by no fault of their own. I also wanted to tag, I just adore my colleagues and everything they've said and the missions and values that they've put forth. But Christine Bowman said a very colleges that change lives sort of thing, which is that empowering the student with the choice whether or not to submit. That's a very CTCL kind of thing to do. So let me back up. Since our origin, since our beginnings, and we were inspired by Lauren Pope's seminal work, Colleges That Change Lives, 40 Schools You Should Know About, back in 1996. And our schools were named in that book, and now there are 44 of us, and you can see where we are on this map. But our schools, started traveling together to get the word out, not just about the liberal arts and about the transformative experiences available on all of our campuses, but also to bring the focus back to students at the center of this entire process, that it really is indeed about the student and what they value, and can they find the values that they hold most dear mirrored on the campuses that may or may not be lucky enough to have them, may be lucky enough to have them. Can they identify communities that will nurture them, that will challenge them, and that will launch them into opportunities and futures that they might not have imagined otherwise, all within the context of the liberal arts. And so I would like to say that the Colleges That Change Lives have been doing this kind of whole student review for a very long time, even before it was hip. And of our 44 institutions, only 2 require either the ACT or the SAT, and that's New College in Florida, which is a public institution, and so is probably, as some of you have talked about in the chat, tied to state expectations. And then Hillsdale College in Michigan requires an exam for admission. But 42 of our schools were test optional during the pandemic, and as you've heard already from my colleagues, many of them had made the decision to go test-free before the onset of the pandemic, and others are continuing to be test-free or test optional for multiple year cycles in an effort to gather data and then make final decisions over the next couple of years. What we want to encourage students and families and counselors to focus on is that there are more than 12 schools, there are more than the sweatshirt schools, and that we believe our institutions, again, not just the admissions officers, but the faculty that are getting to work with the students that are enrolling, are most interested in that student's individuality, the kinds of things they've accomplished, the questions they ask, the adventures they imagine having, maybe the travel abroad or the research that they want to do, and making sure that they find that at that college. In a way, thank you for that list. And I saw a question just pop up in the chat. The college in California is St. Mary's College of California up in Moraga. So here are the 44. Oh, and by the way, there were 2 that were test-free before anything happened, and I just feel like I need to give them a shout out. And that's Hampshire and the University of Lynchburg. And so they had held that philosophy for a long, long time. There is variety and diversity among our schools. There are public institutions. There are religiously faith-affiliated institutions. There is a men's college. Wabash College is a men's college. And then Agnes Scott is a college primarily for women. And so there are schools that tend to be a little funkier, that have a different sort of vibe on campus. There are campuses that are a little more conservative in terms of their political views and or their relationship with the federal government. That's Hillsdale, because they don't accept any federal assistance. So they are completely independent of that, which may say, anyway, that's a whole other story that we don't have time for in this conversation. But there's a diversity and a breadth to the Colleges That Change Lives, but the things that they have in common have everything to do with putting the student at the center, with championing the liberal arts and creating spaces, places, and times for students to embrace what they are interested in, to discover what they may not know they were interested in relationships with faculty are critical. It's teaching faculty on campuses and their communities. And those communities have been holistic, like I said, for a very long time. I think a lot of institutions are finally catching up with the colleges that change lives.
And thank you for giving that overview and shout out about how holistic our schools are and have been forever in our admission process. I think that's what allowed many of us to, I'm going to use that dreaded P word that we now hate, but pivot when it came time to making that test optional transition, because we were already used to reading files so closely. And I know one of the comments was asking about, one of the comments in the chat was talking about kind of leaning into rigor more heavily. And Christine and Cathy and I can talk about our own experiences in the reading process, and that is true. I would agree. We always looked at rigor of curriculum, and the past 2 years of being test free in that first read means we're placing a greater amount of emphasis on rigor, but it's rigor within the context of the high school. And so, and I think that's something that all of our schools are able to actually dive into and pay attention to, because we do have smaller application loads. We are focused on the student-centered admission process, so we tend to spend a little more time digging behind just numbers. And so we're trying to pay attention to what opportunities are available to a student to take advantage of. So rigor looks different for every individual applicant. But it is a major factor, but it has always been a major factor, I suspect, in all of our admission processes. Cathy shared some great information about the correlation between test score prediction and first-year GPA. We did a similar study a while ago as well and found almost identical results to Wooster's results. I just don't have pretty graphs to share, and they weren't as extensive as Wooster's because it was just one admission counselor diving into the data. But what we found was one of the most important factors of correlation was a certain level of advanced rigor. It was not necessarily the most advanced level. In fact, if you take more than between 5 and 7 APs, assuming you have access to a whole host of APs. So in that context, if you take more than 5 or 7, between 5 and 7, it doesn't matter if you've taken 7, 10, 15, or if you're one of those students at White Station High School in Memphis and you've taken 25. There's no greater indication of rigor, but you should have that 5 to 7 range within a context of a school that offers a robust healthy offerings of APs. That data doesn't mean anything for a school that doesn't have different gradations of rigor or different levels of rigor. But it can sometimes get that granular when you're trying to figure out doing that.
Yeah. So I think we've covered a lot of information, and we've given everyone here emails, and this presentation will be posted on my website too. I'll have it up there by Monday. But there are lots of questions and there are lots of comments. We have about 10 minutes remaining. So let's go to some of the questions. I see some questions have been answered, which has been really great. Lots of great conversation. I mean, as Steve said, we're as counselor, and I'm a counselor here in California. So I'm really having that conversation because my students know I don't need this for the University of California. I don't need it for California State University. Why should I even bother with the test? So I'm having to have those conversations. And yet, as Pamela has pointed out, like here in the West, we have the WUI consortium that can benefit a lot of students. Here in California, my students can spend less by going out of state than staying in state. So there's a lot of real important conversations. So let's go ahead and go to some of the questions. And if you have something you put in the chat that you want to have addressed, go ahead and put it in the questions so that we can address it there. And
Cyndy, I think one of the last ones that popped in by Julie Warner is probably at the heart of everything that our IEC colleagues worry about. And that is, how do we convince eager parents who have lived and died by their test scores that test optionals will not disadvantage their student? And I think that's the battle we're all working on, both you all in your counseling roles, but even us as institutions. As I mentioned earlier, in Texas, we were one of a very few number of institutions that had test optional policies. And so students didn't understand, they just don't get that this can be a real positive element for you, and that a conversation or a second writing sample, or for a long time, we had some institutions that were allowing video essays as a way to present yourself. There is more than just a test score to present who you are, what your strengths are, what your application will be all about. And I don't have an answer, but I think that's the situation we're all fighting. Maybe some of my other colleagues have thoughts as to how we can win this war.
Yeah, I'm going to take a different lens here. So in the spring, I get asked to do a lot of panels, right? And so I'm on panels with some very highly selective schools, and, all the way down. They like to have panels represent a whole host of colleges. And what I will say, and what has been so great, is that the pandemic really shook this world. It really challenged even those uber selective schools to say what CTCL had been doing for a long time. How can we really read holistically? How can we get at the heart of what really matters about a student? And what I can tell you from at least the panels that I've been on with highly selective schools, and by highly selective, I mean 15% or under admit rates, that when the student was test optional, they were test optional. It did not negatively impact their chances of getting in. They had the same chance to be one of 15 students out of 100 to be admitted at that school without test scores and with test scores. And what a couple of them further shared, and there was hints of this earlier in the chat, was that unless your test scores were really, really good, like top of the top, it almost wasn't to your advantage to send those in. Now, so what does that mean moving forward? We don't know. And so that's why we're still talking about it. That's why there's so many of you on this call. That's why there's so much anxiety. But what I can say is, at least for this next year, for the schools that are still test optional, I think it's a great year. I have a junior who's about to be applying to schools. It's still a great year for them to be test free, and they can decide if they want to do a lot of test prep and shoot for those high scores, whatever that high score might be for their tiers that they're applying to. And if they don't hit that mark, I really believe, from talking to other directors at other schools, that they're going to be okay. The schools in the pandemic have found ways that they can use their rubrics for admissibility without using test scores. Now, will they go back in 3 years and 2 years? I don't know. We'll kind of have to see. Christine also raised a larger point that if we get away from test scores completely, all the colleges are going to have to find other ways to build their class with names, right? So there's some pressure out there from a totally different vantage point. But so that's what I would share on that point.
And I think it has to do with, thank you, Cathy. I think it also, it begs the conversation. Look at what the family and the student really values in terms of what they're looking for in the college experience, right? So if they highly value test scores and are using that as a measure of excellence in a post-secondary institution, you may not be able to sway them, right? They may not ever be able to be convinced that that's something to look beyond. But I think it opens up a door for a deeper conversation about what that student and family are hoping to get out of that student's undergraduate experience, right? And so what kind of, you almost revisit the basics we go back to. What will you need to be happy in college? And what kind of faculty interaction are you looking for? What kind of community do you want to be a part of? Who do you want to be sitting next to in class? How do you want to be challenged? What kinds of experiences do you want to augment your academic ones? And as a matter of fact, what do you want the academic experiences to look like? Because I think then that helps lead into reminding folks that there are, 3,900 colleges in this country and several fabulous ones that are academically rigorous. I know 44 at least that I represent that do and produce great things in phenomenal people, or take phenomenal people and make them even more phenomenal, that are truly transformative. But anyway, that may or may not be as married to the idea that a standardized test score is the end all be all. So my flippant answer was going to be show them this presentation and so that they can hear reinforced what you're saying. But I just wanted to say that I think it opens up for a broader conversation about what the student family is really looking for and what they're valuing in the experience.
And are you saying that admit rate alone or exclusivity alone doesn't produce an outstanding, talented, rigorous student with an amazing career track? Okay.
I mean, que escándalo that I'm saying that out loud in a recorded session, but I may be leaning that way. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I'll stop because I could go forever on that.
And just to go along with what you're saying, Anne, I think that what this does for us as IECs is gives us a chance to have conversations that we may not have had with our students and families. The conversation about time utilization. And, there are students who, if they spend a little bit more time on their coursework and less time on test prep, they would have better grades. If they spent more time on their extracurriculars and with their families and friends, they may be healthier and may make for a better college prospect. So those conversations are important and go along with what you're saying.
Yeah, well, and I think the messaging, I can't help it. It's my secondary soul. I think the messaging to young people that you are enough cannot be reinforced too many times. You are enough. And it makes me a little squishy. It makes me emotional. That the experiences you've chosen to be a part of and the courses that you've taken and the ways that you've challenged yourself and grown as an individual and the unknown makes you a highly qualified applicant. The trick is finding the institutions that are going to appreciate that and want you to impact them in the same way they want to impact you, right? And so, and I think that's why I'm such a CTCL geek and why I have been since my very own college search, pre-CTCL, believe this or not. My first choice college was the University of Puget Sound. I did not go there. I ended up going to a small women's college in Los Angeles, which turned out to be the very best thing for me. But anyway, if I don't talk about me for 45 minutes, I get bored. So I had to bring me up. But I think, I tell students all the time and did in my past work, put your crown on. Remember that you are enough, that you are a compelling applicant, and that test score is just, unfortunately, one overhyped piece of information, which is easy for me to say on this side, but I just wanted to say that too. So thanks, Steve, for bringing us back to that.
But I would say, though, as we're looking at all of this, we are going to have students who do test well. And so for some of those students, that's going to become the thing that's going to set them apart too. And so trying to identify that as part of who they are and, what's going to differentiate them. I think that's one of the things that I'm seeing as a counselor that the test optional has offered. So, there's both sides to the story and part of who the students are. So I do see a comment and we're running out of time, but I want to put it out there because Cathy brings up this question and we all deal with this with parents and students. And I'm sure you hear this all too. But if a student isn't at XYZ high school and submits a score and the student B at that same high school does not, if it's all equal, the test score isn't going to make a difference. So what do you tell parents when they ask you, or us as counselors, when you ask you those questions?
First, I would ask the question, how on earth could all things be equal?
That's exactly right.
Unless the two students are twins who have literally done every single class the exact same time, exact same way, exact same activities, exact same GPA, their teachers think exactly the same of them. I mean, there's no way for two students from the same high school to be exactly equal, especially when you're taking all of the extra factors in a holistic review process into consideration. So I know that's being nitpicky, but that's the whole point of the holistic review, of getting to know these students as individual, amazing human beings. They're not going to be exactly the same. One's going to have a more rigorous curriculum. One's going to have greater investment in the community around them, whatever that looks like for them. One's going to have a stronger personal statement or writing ability that shines through in the words that they share with us. One's going to have visited campus or explored or done some outreach with us or gotten to actually feel like they're investing in their own college search. So the likelihood of two students being exactly the same is nil. And I would also say, I mean, our process, it wouldn't matter.
I would also say that even in a student-centered search, if they were exactly the same, are they all looking for the same things in a college? If a college has a profile in front of them and they're looking to have more of certain demographic or more of certain majors or more of certain whatever, they're looking at those fit pieces too. So it's not just, the test score, the grades, everything that we've been talking about. They need to think about how they fit into the context of that school and what that school is looking for as well, and how they can really showcase that when they're looking at all of those schools. So, but yeah, nicely said, Lauren.
Yeah. Well, and what that points to too is a message that we're sharing with parents in our whole community, on both sides of the desk, is so often, especially parents and media, think this is the net sum process, right? If this student A gets into this college, student B got left out, but it doesn't work that way. It's not as you pointed out, Lauren, students are looked at from their own perspective, and one getting in doesn't keep another student out or another student from this, that, or the other. And that's really hard. And I think not only is that hard for domestic students, US students, but particularly for international students, and families to grasp that. And that's part of our role as counselors in colleges to help communicate that and be able to do that. So
it's that darn Tina Fey movie where they push a button and one falls through the floor, just perpetuating that myth.
Thank you everyone for being with us today, and just lots of really great conversation, and we will be continuing these, and I know there'll be a great opportunity in Philadelphia as everybody is at the IECA conference, and then later on in June at the HECA conference. I don't know if registration is still open for IECA or not, because I think it starts on Monday, but I know registration for HECA is still open. And if you're interested in the PDI, the Professional Development Institute, well, Steve and I are involved in that. There's still room for you to come join us and several other great faculty. We're going to be welcoming Christine. She's going to participate in PDI. And we also have the National College Advocacy Group. The NCAG conference is going to be the first week of June. That's going to be all virtual. Registration is open for that. Liane's going to put that in the chat. Cathy's going to be joining us for that. She's going to be one of our keynote speakers at the NCAG. So lots of great things and lots of great professional development opportunities. I'm taking a hiatus. I'm going to be traveling and doing lots of things. So I'll be back with Friday Forums in July. And Gina Laster and Chris Bell and I are going to talk about scaling your business. So that'll be our next Friday Forum. But I will have some other webinars and things like that. So I'm not going away totally. So again, thank you, Lauren and Anne and Christine and Cathy and Steve and Sarah and Liane. Thank you for everybody. And everybody that's here on our show. We had over 150 people here today. So we hope you have a great weekend and safe travels, and have wonderful graduations. I understand all the college graduations are going on. That's so exciting. So thank you, everyone. And
thank you, Cyndy.